Conversation with Professor Andrew Linklater. We would like to start by asking about your view of the contemporary international community. In the transformation of political community, ethical foundations of the post-Westphalian era, you argued that sovereign nation-states have been deeply exclusionary in their dealings with minority cultures and alien outsiders, and through globalization, the pacification of core areas of the world economy and ethnic revolt, new forms of political community and citizenship have become possible. Considering the lack of solidarity in the international community manifesting in, for instance, the cases of different political preferences between developed and developing countries, economic and political cracks among the developed countries, the refugee crisis, and the recent COVID-19 outbreak, do you still believe that such a community is possible?
The argument was that the triple transformation of political community, more universalist, more sensitive to cultural differences, and more committed to the reduction of material inequalities, is an imminent possibility in modern societies. The emphasis was on normative ideals that are already anticipated by the development of modern conceptions of citizenship. The point was to highlight the positive qualities of those societies and their moral cultural resources. I have not moved away from that normative standpoint, but would now focus much more on changing balances of power between political groups and the ideals they espouse. Here I follow the line of argument that was developed by Norbert Elias in his analysis of the European civilizing process. Elias had an acute awareness of competing tendencies in societies and fluctuating balances of power between different forces. A central argument was that many groups in modern societies have deep commitments to global political projects. But the drag effect of national loyalties remains strong. Those particularistic attachments have become more powerful in recent times. National populist movements have mounted a strong challenge to globalism, to what is portrayed as a global establishment that has been indifferent to the material interests and cultural preferences of outsider groups. But national populism arouses a counter-response that is internationalist or cosmopolitan in orientation. The COVID-19 health and economic crises may alter the balance of power between those competing forces. Support for globalism may increase. It is too early to tell.
Question. Considering the developing countries playing a more active role in regional and international relations for quite a while now, what would the liberal world order stand for in the post-COVID-19 context?
What stands out at the present time is the fact that people turn to the state when they fear for their security. The state remains the key survival unit, to use Elias's terminology. Its monopoly powers, its controls over the instruments of force and taxation, have been expressed in unexpected ways, including enforced national lockdowns and the closure of borders. Not so long ago, analysts argued that the state was being hollowed out by economic globalization. It is clear that many states have acquired new powers of public surveillance and regulation that will not be relinquished. Serious concerns about personal freedoms have been raised in liberal societies. The upshot is a tilt against the liberal world order that may be hard to reverse. Of course, the critique of that order has been central to Chinese and Russian foreign policy. Economic globalization may be restored quickly when the current crisis comes to an end. One must wonder whether its revival will seem so urgent that global environmental problems are sidelined, or those who propose linking economic reconstruction with major changes in fossil fuel-dependent economies will make headway. Perhaps we should expect major power struggles over short-term and long-term directions of change.
Question. In your book, The Problem of Harm in World Politics, Theoretical Investigations, you analyze the problem of harm in world politics that stems from the fact that societies require the power to harm in order to defend themselves from internal and external threats, but must also control the capacity to harm so that people cannot kill, injure, humiliate, or exploit others as they please. Regarding the normative aspects of the non-human world, how would you deal with harm caused by the COVID-19 type of pandemics considering the human effect of its emergence? It is useful to recall that thinkers such as Karl Marx believed that a great transformation was taking place, in which unintended harm to people in distant places was rising relative to the age-old deliberate harm that societies inflicted on each other through war and conquest. Rephrasing the point, transnational harm was on the increase with lengthening and deepening interconnections between peoples. The COVID-19 health and economic crisis is the product of global linkages that are more imprinted on the minds of people everywhere than ever before. It could not have occurred in the absence of relatively peaceful relations between relatively stable major powers. Citizens of those states are free from the danger of dying in war, but exposed to economic and environmental risks and the danger of pandemics. Rising levels of transnational harm create major problems for forms of political community held together by national loyalties that were forged in warfare. Modern states and peoples are not geared toward dealing effectively in international or cosmopolitan ways with the negative effects of lengthening global interconnections. Many people think the nation-state can shield them from external dangers. Others look beyond the nation-state, but there is no image of a post-national or post-Westphalian world order that commands significant support. People have yet to become attuned to thinking in such ways. If you allow me, we would like to continue with the harm concept. The world is witnessing the highest levels of displacement on record. Millions of people around the world have been forced from home by conflict and persecution. Bearing this in mind, what is your approach to the responsibility to protect as a cosmopolitan harm principle?
The idea of the responsibility to protect has been a core feature of liberal endeavors to reform the global order, although analysts have stressed that many different cultures and civilizations find common ground in opposition to serious abuses of human rights or human dignity. From an English school perspective, the doctrine represents a shift from the pluralist standpoint that highlights the problem of order in international politics to the solidarist position, which focuses on the fundamental rights of individuals. Collective action to prevent human rights atrocities remains elusive for familiar reasons. The idea of humanitarian intervention does not command much support in the society of states. Many populations have become weary of overseas commitments. Many people oppose them in principle. Critics of the responsibility to protect rightly focus on the highly selective nature of Western responses to human rights violations. There is no reason to think that much will change on those fronts in the foreseeable future, not least because of current national challenges. I have long admired John Vincent's position on human rights, which stressed the resident emergency of starvation in the modern world. Vincent was acutely aware of the fact that Western liberal conceptions of human rights do not resonate with large sections of the world's population. The upshot of his argument is that it is problematic to care about human rights and to do little to eradicate starvation. Many would argue that a similar point can be made about the right to a decent environment or to basic health care in the poorest societies. One must wonder whether the COVID-19 crisis will result in stronger international support for a broadened conception of human rights to protect the vulnerable from disease and to deal with the predicted rise in the number of people who will be on the verge of starvation given the current crisis.
In the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, Marx states that men make their history, but not under of their own choosing. You discussed that statement as follows in one of your speeches. It is an astonishing statement because at one and the same time, it captures the point that human beings are initiators, individually and collectively, of history, and yet we have lost control of many of our creations. History is a human product, but it has been made in ways that people do not really understand and do not control. In that discussion, can we take out human beings and put the nation-states instead? Furthermore, from that point, can we similarly deal with the Brexit process and claim that the United Kingdom opted out of the European Union, EU, to make or to resume its own history? How do you understand Brexit?
But what are nation-states if not people making their own history but not under conditions of their choosing? They consist of diverse groups, pulling in different directions and constraining each other's possibilities. What Marx's statement raised more crisply than ever before was the question of how people can reduce the tyranny of unnecessary constraints and expand their freedoms, collectively and individually. Your question rightly stresses that Marx's statement was too vague. Of course, he believed that people were divided into social classes within particular modes of production and largely ignored social stratification along the lines of gender and race. Nationalism, geopolitics, and war were missing from the main line of argument. Rephrasing the point, Marx combined the deep awareness of growing interconnections between human societies with too little emphasis on the effects of intersocietal dynamics on the long-term development of humanity. Elias used the term survival unit to overcome the failure of classical sociology to investigate that domain. He referred to the drag effect of national loyalties to stress the resistance of many groups to any attempt to transfer powers to international organizations. The point has significance for understanding Brexit and the national populist surge more generally, focusing on exercising greater power over events through reasserting state power and national loyalties. But hopes will be dashed. States will remain at the mercy of forces they cannot control without major advances in international cooperation. Many groups understand that, of course, but the problem of balancing national and international responsibilities and attachments remains unsolved.
Since you are one of the leading critical IR theorists, what do you think about the place of critical theory and the role of critical theorists in the world today?
Frankfurt School critical theory was an important influence on the normative position outlined earlier, but it has had little impact on the sociological perspective I have worked on over the last 15 or so years. I have found richer resources in Eliasian process sociology. The relationship between critical theory and process sociology is enormously complicated. Elias was opposed to partisan investigation. He was a powerful advocate of what he called the detour of detachment, of research that was not driven by taking sides in contemporary social and political struggles. Not that Elias was indifferent to human conditions. It has been argued that a form of secular humanism underpins his perspective, and that he was highly critical of nation-centered academic approaches and public policies given the problems affecting humanity as a whole. For Elias, detachment was integral to that humanism. Only by understanding more about uncontrolled social processes could people discover ways of alleviating misery and insecurity. Critical theory and process sociology are at odds in many respects, but they converge in important ways, as argued in my forthcoming book on civilization and world order. All I will add is that process sociology provides means of analyzing the social world that go beyond critical theory and other approaches with which I am familiar.
Thank you for your time and sincere answers.